Welcome to this module on analyzing ESL and EFL textbooks and curriculum materials. Before viewing this presentation, be sure to have read Brown and Lee chapters 11 and 12. By the end of this module, we will be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses of ESL and EFL textbooks, use text effectively when teaching, and look into creating our own communicative-based instructional materials. In effect, we want to know how to select a good ESL or EFL textbook and how to supplement it as needed. So the first step in knowing how to choose a good English textbook is to understand the different types of textbooks available in the field. There are 5 main types. We have core texts, supplemental or skill-specific texts, grammar texts, content-based texts, and reference texts. Let's examine each of these in more detail. Core textbooks are those that serve as a comprehensive and foundational text to an ESL or EFL class. They usually seek to develop all 4 language skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing according to a leveled sequence. In other words, core texts develop language skills according to proficiency levels. The levels are based on grammar points, vocabulary, and the readability needed for students to grow their language skills within a particular language proficiency level. For example, a beginning core textbook would focus on the verb to be, basic verb tenses, and English word order, and teach the vocabulary to talk about everyday life and situations. Sometimes core texts have ancillaries available, such as workbooks for extra practice, CDs or websites with quizzes and extra practice, or reproducible worksheets the teacher can pull as needed. Here are some examples of popular core ESL and EFL textbooks in our field. If you wish, you may take a few moments to pause the video and Google these textbooks to take a closer look at them. Supplemental or skill-specific textbooks take a more in-depth look into the individual language skills, such as listening, speaking, reading, writing, vocabulary, grammar, or pronunciation. Supplemental text can be used alongside a core text, or if you are teaching a skill-specific class, like a conversation class or a writing class, these textbooks can be used alone. When looking at supplemental texts, it is important to make sure that they are appropriate for your students' proficiency level and language needs, because they are not always leveled. Here are some examples of popular supplemental ESL and EFL textbooks in our field. If you wish, you may take a few moments to pause the video and Google these textbooks to take a closer look at them. Grammar textbooks are just that. They focus specifically on the grammar patterns and rules of the English language. They are also considered a supplemental or skill-specific text, but are often used like core textbooks for grammar classes. Grammar text that can be used instructionally includes the grammar rules and explanations, examples, and practice exercises. But some grammar texts are more like reference texts that simply list rules and explanations, but do not include practice exercises, and thus should not be used as core texts. But like any other English text, grammar texts must consider language proficiency in order to be effective. Here are some examples of popular ESL and EFL grammar textbook series in our field. If you wish, you may take a few moments to pause the video and Google these textbooks to take a closer look at them. Content-based textbooks focus on specific subjects or topics according to students' needs for English. For example, we often see content-based textbooks that develop English skills for taking the U.S. citizenship exam, or to help students prepare for the TOEFL test or other language exam, or even to develop specific academic language skills to succeed in college. Content-based text can be leveled, but most focus more on the topic of the text, thereby requiring the teacher to supplement the text with extra language support depending on students' proficiency levels. Here are some examples of popular content-based ESL and EFL textbooks in our field. If you wish, you may take a few moments to pause the video and Google these textbooks to take a closer look at them. Lastly, reference texts are books that provide lists of information about language and are not recommended to serve as a core textbook. Often, reference texts are used for self-study, additional help, or to work alongside a core or skill-specific text. Reference texts are based on commonly occurring language patterns and vocabulary. In other words, reference texts rarely capture 100% of the English language, and instead opt for words and grammar patterns that students are most likely to encounter. Common types of reference texts include dictionaries, thesauri, and phrase books. Here are some examples of popular ESL and EFL reference texts in the field. If you wish, you may take a few moments to pause the video and Google these textbooks to take a closer look at them. So now that we know more about the types of textbooks available in the field, how do we set about finding a good one? First, we should make sure that the purpose or goal of the textbook aligns with the English course you are teaching. One way to ensure this is to reference a set of curriculum standards and see if the standards you wish to develop in your course are covered in the textbook. You can find information about a textbook's purpose or objective by reading through the publisher's description, any notes to the student or teacher in the textbook, and by browsing through the table of contents. The next step is to examine the textbook's table of contents to see the scope of the material that is covered and how it is organized and sequenced. One way to check if the content and sequencing matches your student's proficiency level is by comparing the table of contents with a set of curriculum standards and/or language proficiency indicators, such as those in the pre-K through 12 curriculum frameworks, Common Core State Standards, or the Massachusetts Adult Curriculum Frameworks. After looking at the table of contents, browse through a few units and see if the textbook incorporates all 4 language skills. Ask yourself, does it also use real-life situations or functions as the basis for language practice? Another indicator of textbook quality is one that presents listening and reading activities before having students practice speaking and writing the language, thus mirroring natural language acquisition. Text units and lessons should also adhere to the 3 Ps organizing principle of communicative language teaching. So look for an organization where there is a presentation of new skills first, followed by a guided and structured practice, and concluding with productive activities that get students to speak and write using the new grammar and vocabulary skills they have gained. Next, a textbook should be teacher-friendly, meaning that it provides sufficient guidance for an ESL or EFL teacher to use the textbook within her or his class. Therefore, look for notes to the teacher on how to use the text and conduct lessons using it. Each unit should also present the goals or objectives for the lessons contained within, as well as provide lists of vocabulary or grammar skills that will be covered and recycled throughout. A good text even sometimes includes lists of any extra materials or supplementary materials that can be used with the unit, or tell the teacher how to group learners for interactive activities. Sometimes texts have a teacher's manual companion to the student text, which often includes step-by-step instructions and lesson plans already done for the teacher. Core texts also often have ancillary texts available to the teacher and contain reproducible and ready-to-use illustrations, worksheets, or assessments along with answer keys. Just as a text should be friendly for the teacher, it should also be student-friendly. Students should also be able to understand and use the table of contents to know what content they will be learning in the text. Units should also be thematically arranged, meaning that the language skills within the unit all pertain to developing the language of talking about a particular topic, such as job interviewing skills, making introductions, or related to a piece of literature. Color illustrations and photos, along with a clear and readable font size and a well-organized page, is also helpful to make the pages pleasing to the eye and not overcrowded with content. Text should also present authentic examples and practice activities that integrate and point out useful vocabulary. A glossary that provides definitions of words and answer keys also helps students to use the textbook not only in class, but also outside the classroom for self-study purposes. However, it is rare for textbooks to contain everything needed to make an engaging and truly communicative lesson. It is thus important for teachers to be aware of how to best supplement the textbook. It is recommended that teachers bring in real-world examples of language and/or current event articles from the local context, such as articles about Boston history or creating English menus for restaurants, or how to attract more tourists to a particular town. Lastly, the best way to supplement a textbook you choose for your class is to survey your students and find out what their interests and needs are for English, and incorporate the content that matches what they want. You can even ask them to bring in any materials they find interesting, or even give them choices for activities and tasks to practice the language. So once we've decided on a textbook and any supplemental materials, it is time to use these materials effectively to teach our students. One of the most important things to remember about using texts effectively is that they do not and cannot replace you as the teacher. First of all, it is rare that a teacher can cover an entire textbook within a term, so it is up to you, the teacher, to be selective and purposeful in choosing the content, the skills and exercises in the text that meet your students' individual needs. Also, it is critical that teachers bring in their own visuals, games, readings, and writing experiences that incorporate students' interests and, again, their needs. What makes an ESL or EFL course successful and memorable is the personal touch and flair that the teacher brings to the class. Along the same lines of personalizing the instruction of the course, it is important to bring in real-world examples of language from the neighborhood and community. Get students to engage with these real-world examples and uses of language through interactive activities. One of the most engaging activities I used to do with my students was to take them to the local mall and complete a scavenger hunt to practice language with employees and others in an authentic environment. It is also good practice to have students preview textbook content by doing chapter walks, where they skim and scan the pages to build background and make predictions about the skills they will learn. You can also provide students with word and phrase lists to take home and study before engaging in a main lesson that practices the words and phrases they have previewed. This strategy gets students to begin to get multiple exposures to terminology, which thus helps them to acquire them. Along these lines, it is important not only to focus on the vocabulary words the textbook identifies as important. Pick out other words and phrases that you see in the text that your students might benefit from. It is also important to consider that vocabulary is not just single words. There are also set and variable phrases and phrasal verbs that help build students' fluency, and often textbooks ignore these types of words. Therefore, it is up to you, the teacher, to look for these bundles of words to teach our students. We will learn language in chunks of words, not words in isolation. So as stated before, textbooks do not replace the teacher. So how do we supplement textbooks with our own curriculum materials? First, we can add leveled readings to our textbook units. If we bring in readings from our local context or readings that match students' interests, it is important to make sure that the readings are not too easy or too hard for our students to read. That means we might need to edit the language to simplify the vocabulary and grammar of the text. This means using more common terms, taking out any confusing idioms, bolding vocabulary words we will teach our students, or even providing some first language support if needed. There is a great website called rewordify.com that can automatically simplify language of any electronic text, and it's a great tool for leveled readings. It is also helpful to not just rely on the examples the textbook provides, but also bring in examples from the local context or from your own life. For example, use the Red Sox and grammar examples, or share a story from your own language learning experiences. Students enjoy authentic examples that bring life into the classrooms. But a key thing to remember, make sure your examples do not present an exception to the rule, but truly exemplify the grammar point to be practiced. For example, if studying how to make the passive form of verbs, be careful that the verb to be plus the verb plus ed is truly in the passive voice and not using the verb plus ed form as an adjective. An example of this would be, the New England Patriots are headed to the Super Bowl. At first glance, "are headed to" looks like the passive voice, but it is not. Headed is actually used as an adjective here. Instead, a passive voice sentence would be, the New England Patriots' victory in Super Bowl 49 was celebrated by fans in Boston. We have the passive voice construction, was celebrated. Creating your own activities can also help make a class fun and allow you to personalize your class. When thinking about engaging in a language practice activity, it is fundamental to make sure you pre-teach the vocabulary and grammar instructions in and for the activity. Again, this means not only focusing on the vocabulary in the textbook. An effective language activity also needs to have clear but relatively simple directions for how to do the activity. Teachers should also provide oral and written directions as well as model and demonstrate how to do the activity before asking students to do it on their own. Here are some examples of effective activities for language practice. I get many ideas for activities from two websites called Dave's ESL Cafe Idea Cookbook and BreakingNewsEnglish.com. You can visit these two websites by clicking on the links to them below in the module resources. You may pause this video now should you wish to explore the websites in further detail. So, when we're thinking about assessing our students, we want to make sure we assess in a similar manner to how we teach the language. That is, if we are doing a lot of conversation practice in a conversation class, we should have students think about completing a rubric self-assessing their own conversational skills. Assessment should also have clear but simple instructions that provide oral and written directions and examples for how to complete the assessment. And it's also important that if we're assessing our students' language, we need to provide feedback on their assessments in order for them to notice any changes they need to make and how to improve their language. So now that you know more about how to choose an effective ESL, EFL textbook and curriculum materials, how to use the materials you select, and how to go about supplementing texts within your own curriculum, it is now your turn to put this into practice. Research 5 to 7 ESL or EFL curriculum materials according to the guidelines presented in this module. You can find ESL textbooks in our library, free sample units on publishers' websites, or find ebook versions online. You do not have to purchase materials to do this assignment, and it is okay if the materials you find in the end are not the best to use. You simply need to practice doing such analyses. So here is an example of how to look at a unit from a textbook. This is the first page of a unit in the beginning ESL textbook called Side by Side. You will notice the theme is the present continuous verb tense, and the situation or communicative function of the unit is everyday activities. On this page, it seeks to build students' background knowledge of key verbs in the continuous test by using color illustrations, which is effective and student-friendly. What we don't see here are any step-by-step instructions or directions for the teacher or students on how to use this page. It is then up to the teacher to know how to use this page effectively for instruction or look for a teacher's manual companion to this textbook. We can see that this unit is set up using the 3P structure for communicative language teaching. This page provides the grammatical rule of forming the present continuous verb tense. Then it presents the vocabulary in an illustration of neighbors asking and answering questions about everyday activities. As such, it attempts to replicate real-world conversation, although it is somewhat forced here in order to give students the repetition needed to begin to identify the grammar and vocabulary. Here we can see that the unit contains reading and listening activities for students to receive input using the verb tense. We can see that the receptive skills are presented first in the unit, mirroring natural language acquisition and an effective way to organize practice activities. You will also see that the input is in the form of a newspaper article and listening to a news broadcast, two real-world sources of language for English learners. However, I would love to see directions or an objective printed on the page to give guidance to the teachers and students on what to do with these activities. But it is great to see both reading and listening presented. Lastly, we have the production portion of the unit where the teacher provides guided practice for the students to begin forming questions and answering questions in the present continuous form. Again, I would have liked to see directions for how to group students to complete this activity, as well as written directions for teachers and students on how to complete these dialogues. Teachers may also wish to provide a couple more of localized examples to add to the general practice presented here in the text. This unit so far features reading, listening, and speaking, but to make it complete, it would need to have a writing activity. Perhaps the teacher could have students use this page to practice speaking and write down their dialogues. So, for your own analyses, examine the purpose of the materials you've selected. What proficiency level, goals, and objectives do they meet? Does it align with curriculum standards? How well does the text cover content and sequence topics? How is it organized? What is the intended audience and how might the item be used? Is it student and teacher friendly? How well does it cover content and sequence topics? and what might you need to supplement if you use these materials. Good luck!